The sound of a pistol cocking echoed through the dusty street of Promise Creek, silencing the midday chatter of the small Wyoming Territory town in the summer of 1876. Elizabeth Palmer closed her eyes, feeling the hot tears streak down her dirt-smudged face as her brother Thomas roughly gripped her arm, displaying her like cattle at auction to the three leering men before them. $200 and she's yours, Thomas slurred, the whiskey on his breath potent enough to make Elizabeth's stomach turn. Pretty little thing, ain't she? 20 years old and knows how to cook, clean, and keep a man happy. The tallest of the three men, a heavy-set, bearded fellow with yellowed teeth and a scar running from eye to chin, stepped forward, eyeing Elizabeth as if she were a prized mare. Might be worth it. Let's have a closer look. Elizabeth jerked backward as the man reached for her face, but Thomas's grip tightened painfully. Please, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Thomas, don't do this. Shut your mouth, Thomas hissed, shoving her forward. Pa's dead 6 months and your uselessness has nearly bankrupted me. Consider yourself lucky I found buyers instead of leaving you to starve. The bearded man's calloused fingers grabbed her chin, forcing her to look up. Open your mouth, girl. Let me see your teeth. I think the lady said no. The deep voice cut through the tension like a knife. All heads turned toward the newcomer, a tall figure on horseback at the edge of the street, silhouetted against the setting sun. The stranger dismounted in one fluid motion, boots hitting the dirt with a soft thud as his spurs jingled with each deliberate step forward. Matthew Morgan moved with the quiet confidence of a man who had seen his share of trouble and wasn't afraid of finding more. His dark Stetson cast shadows across his sun-weathered face, but his eyes, sharp and clear as a mountain creek, were fixed on Thomas with unmistakable intent. This ain't your concern, cowboy, Thomas spat, his hand dropping to the gun at his hip. Matthew's stride never faltered. When a man tries to sell his sister on the open street, it becomes everybody's concern. He stopped 10 paces away, his duster coat shifting to reveal the gleaming Colt revolver at his side. Let her go. The bearded man and his companions took cautious steps backward, suddenly less interested in their potential purchase. Thomas, however, tightened his grip on Elizabeth's arm until she winced. She's my kin. The law says I can do with her as I please. Matthew's expression didn't change, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. Not while I breathe. The tension stretched between them, tight as a bowstring. Elizabeth could hear her heart pounding in her ears as Thomas's fingers dug painfully into her flesh. Who the hell do you think you are? Thomas demanded. Just a man passing through who knows right from wrong. Matthew's voice remained calm, almost conversational, as his hand hovered near his pistol. Now, I'm going to ask one more time. Let her go. The moment hung suspended in the hot afternoon air. Then Thomas shoved Elizabeth to the ground and drew his gun in one clumsy motion. He never had a chance to fire. Matthew's draw was lightning-fast, a blur of movement that ended with Thomas howling in pain, his gun spinning in the dirt, blood streaming from his grazed hand. You shot me, Thomas screamed, clutching his bleeding hand to his chest. I could have put that bullet between your eyes, Matthew replied evenly, his gun still trained on Thomas. Consider yourself fortunate. The three would-be buyers had already backed away, wanting no part of the confrontation. Several townspeople had emerged from nearby buildings, drawn by the commotion. Matthew glanced at Elizabeth, who was struggling to her feet, her calico dress now smeared with street dust. Madam, are you all right? Elizabeth nodded mutely, too shocked to form words. She had never seen anyone draw so fast, and certainly never expected someone, a complete stranger, to stand up for her against Thomas. This ain't over, Thomas snarled, backing away. That's my sister, and I'll do what I want with her." Matthew's voice dropped dangerously low. "If you come near her again, I won't aim for your hand." He turned to the gathering crowd. "Is there a sheriff in this town?" An older man with a silver mustache stepped forward, a tin star pinned to his vest. "I'm Sheriff Donovan. What's happening here?" "This man was trying to sell this young woman to these three characters," Matthew said, gesturing to the retreating men. "Seems to me that's not how a brother should treat his sister." The sheriff's weathered face hardened as he looked at Thomas, who was still clutching his bleeding hand. "That true, Palmer. My sister's my responsibility," Thomas insisted. "What I do with her is bound by the laws of human decency," the sheriff interrupted. "Get yourself to the doctor for that hand, and then I want to see you in my office." He turned to Elizabeth, his expression softening. "Miss Palmer, do you have somewhere safe to stay tonight?" Elizabeth glanced nervously at her brother, then shook her head. "Our family ranch is 5 miles out, but I can't go back there with him." "The boarding house has a spare room," a woman from the crowd offered, stepping forward. "Mrs. Holloway won't mind." Sheriff Donovan nodded. "That'll do for tonight." He turned to Matthew, eyeing him with a mixture of gratitude and suspicion. "And you are, Matthew Morgan, just passing through, heading to Laramie." He holstered his weapon in one smooth motion. "Well, Mr. Morgan, I appreciate your intervention, though I generally prefer folks don't shoot others on my main street." The sheriff's tone was dry but not unfriendly. "You planning to stay in Promise Creek tonight?" Matthew glanced at Elizabeth, who was still trembling slightly, her arms wrapped around herself. Something in his expression softened. "I reckon I could delay my journey by a day or two." The sheriff nodded, satisfied. "Good. I might need your statement about what happened here." He turned to Thomas. "Doctor, then my office. Now." Thomas shot a venomous glare at both Matthew and Elizabeth before stalking away, leaving a trail of blood droplets in the dust. As the crowd began to disperse, Matthew approached Elizabeth. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, evidence of years spent under the harsh western sun, and the small scar that cut through his right eyebrow. He wasn't as young as she'd first thought, perhaps around 30, but his movements had the easy grace of a man comfortable in his own skin. "Are you truly all right, Miss Palmer?" he asked quietly, his voice gentler than before. Elizabeth found her voice at last. "Yes, thank you, Mr. Morgan. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along." She hesitated, then added softly, "Though I fear you've made an enemy of my brother." A ghost of a smile touched Matthew's lips. "I've faced worse." He glanced around the street, then back at her. "May I escort you to the boarding house? I'd feel better knowing you got there safely." Elizabeth nodded, feeling a strange mix of vulnerability and security in this stranger's presence. As they walked side by side down the dusty street, she couldn't help wondering what twist of fate had brought Matthew Morgan to Promise Creek at precisely the moment she needed saving. She couldn't have known then how completely her life would change because of it. The boarding house was a 2-story white clapboard building with green shutters and a wrap-around porch adorned with rocking chairs. Marigolds lined the walkway, their bright orange and yellow blooms adding a touch of cheerfulness to the otherwise modest establishment. Mrs. Holloway, a plump, gray-haired widow with kind eyes and a perpetually flour-dusted apron, took one look at Elizabeth's disheveled appearance and clucked her tongue sympathetically. "Heard the commotion from here," she said, ushering Elizabeth inside. "That brother of yours has been nothing but trouble since your pa passed. Come in, come in. I've got a room upstairs and fresh stew on the stove." Elizabeth hesitated at the threshold, turning to Matthew. "I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Morgan." He removed his hat, revealing thick, dark hair with hints of silver at the temples. No thanks needed, Miss Palmer, just doing what any decent man would do. Mrs. Holloway looked Matthew up and down with an appraising eye. And you, sir, will you be needing a room as well? Matthew nodded. If you have one available, madam. Indeed I do. Been a quiet week in Promise Creek. She smiled warmly. Dinner's served at 6 sharp. Don't be late, or you'll miss my biscuits, and that would be a crying shame. As Mrs. Holloway led them inside, Elizabeth found herself stealing glances at the tall cowboy beside her. There was something both dangerous and reassuring about his presence, like a thunderstorm that brings both destructive lightning and life-giving rain. After being shown to her small but tidy room, Elizabeth washed the dust from her face and hands in the provided basin. The cool water was a blessing against her hot skin. She stared at her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand, hazel eyes red-rimmed from crying, honey-brown hair falling in disarray from its pins, and a small bruise forming where Thomas had gripped her arm. How had it come to this? After their father's death, Thomas had changed, drinking more, gambling away what little money they had, and growing increasingly resentful of Elizabeth's presence. But she never imagined he would try to sell her like property. A gentle knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Palmer," Mrs. Holloway's voice called. "I've brought you a fresh dress. One of my boarders left it behind, and it looks about your size." Elizabeth opened the door to find not only Mrs. Holloway with a folded blue dress, but Sheriff Donovan as well. "Sorry to disturb you, Miss Palmer, but I need to ask you a few questions," the sheriff said, his expression serious but kind. "May I come in?" Elizabeth nodded, stepping back to allow them both entry. Mrs. Holloway set the dress on the bed and quietly excused herself, leaving Elizabeth alone with the lawman. "I've spoken with your brother," Sheriff Donovan began, turning his hat in his hands. "He claims it was all a misunderstanding, says he was just joking around with some friends." Elizabeth's jaw tightened. "It was no joke, Sheriff. Those men were strangers, and Thomas was dead serious about selling me for $200. The sheriff nodded, as if her answer confirmed what he already suspected. "That's what Mr. Morgan said as well." He sighed heavily. "The problem is, Miss Palmer, without those 3 men to corroborate the story, it's your word against your brother's." "And you believe Thomas?" Elizabeth asked, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "I didn't say that." Sheriff Donovan's eyes were kind but weary. "I've known your family since before you were born, Elizabeth. Your father was a good man, Thomas. Well, he's been trouble for years, but this is a new low even for him." He adjusted his stance, his expression growing more serious. "The thing is, Thomas is right about one thing. Under the law, as your closest male relative, he does have certain authority over you. Not to sell you, of course that's definitely illegal. But your father's will left the ranch to Thomas, with provisions that he care for you until you marry." Elizabeth sank onto the edge of the bed, the reality of her situation crashing down upon her. "So I'm trapped?" "Not necessarily." The sheriff stroked his mustache thoughtfully. "I've instructed Thomas to leave town for a few days, cool his head. He's mighty angry about being shot and humiliated in public. In the meantime, we need to figure out your options." "What options?" "I have nowhere else to go, no money of my own." Elizabeth twisted her hands in her lap. "The ranch was my home, but I can't go back there with him." Sheriff Donovan nodded sympathetically. "I understand. For now, you can stay here. Mrs. Holloway has agreed to let you work for your room and board until we sort this out." "Thank you," Elizabeth said quietly. "And Thomas, what will happen to him?" "I gave him a stern warning, but without those men as witnesses." The sheriff shrugged apologetically. "I'll keep an eye on him, and so will others in town. What he tried to do may not be something I can arrest him for with the evidence we have. but folks around here have their own way of dealing with men who mistreat women. After the sheriff left, Elizabeth changed into the borrowed blue dress, grateful to be out of her dust-covered clothes. The dress was simple but well made, with tiny white flowers embroidered around the collar. It fit reasonably well, though it was a bit loose in the waist. When she made her way downstairs for dinner, she found the dining room already occupied by several boarders, a traveling salesman, an elderly couple, and Matthew Morgan, who stood politely when she entered. "Miss Palmer," he greeted her with a slight nod. "You look much refreshed." Elizabeth felt a blush creep into her cheeks. "Thank you again, Mr. Morgan. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't intervened." "Please sit," he said, pulling out the chair next to his. As Elizabeth settled into her seat, Mrs. Holloway bustled in with a large pot of stew and a basket of steaming biscuits. Dinner was a surprisingly pleasant affair, with Mrs. Holloway keeping the conversation flowing with town gossip and questions about Matthew's travels. Elizabeth learned that he had been working as a ranch hand in Montana and was headed to Laramie for a new position. "What kind of work did you do in Montana, Mr. Morgan?" the elderly woman, Mrs. Prescott, asked between bites of stew. "Bit of everything, madam. Breaking horses, driving cattle, mending fences, whatever needed doing." His tone was polite but reserved, as if uncomfortable being the center of attention. "And before Montana," Mr. Prescott pressed, his rheumy eyes curious. A shadow passed over Matthew's face. "I was in the war. After that, I drifted for a while." The brief mention of the war 11 years ended now, but still raw in so many ways, cast a momentary pall over the table. Mrs. Holloway quickly steered the conversation to safer topics, asking about the latest fashions the traveling salesman had seen in Denver. Throughout the meal, Elizabeth found her gaze repeatedly drawn to Matthew. There was something compelling about him, not just his physical presence, which was undeniably impressive, but the quiet thoughtfulness in his eyes, the careful way he chose his words, and the respectful manner with which he addressed everyone at the table. After dinner, as the other boarders retired to their rooms, Elizabeth found herself alone with Matthew on the front porch. The summer evening was warm, the sky painted in vibrant oranges and pinks as the sun disappeared behind the distant mountains. "It's beautiful here," Matthew said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Reminds me a bit of home." "Where is home for you, Mr. Morgan?" Elizabeth asked, settling into one of the rocking chairs. He remained standing, leaning against the porch railing. "Virginia, originally. But that was a lifetime ago." He gazed out at the sunset. "What about you? Have you always lived in Promise Creek?" Elizabeth nodded. "Born and raised on the Palmer Ranch. My father built it from nothing." She couldn't keep the pride from her voice. "We had good years before the drought and before he got sick." "I'm sorry about your father," Matthew said quietly. "And your mother, she died when I was 12. Fever took her." Elizabeth's fingers traced the pattern of her borrowed dress. "It was just Pa Thomas and me after that." Thomas was always wild, but Pa kept him in line. Since Pa died. She trailed off, not wanting to relive the painful months of Thomas's escalating cruelty. Matthew seemed to understand. Some men don't handle responsibility well. "What will you do in Laramie?" Elizabeth asked, eager to change the subject. "I've been hired as foreman on the Rocking J Ranch," he replied. "The owner's getting on in years, needs someone to manage the day-to-day operations." "That sounds like a good position," Matthew nodded. "Steady work, decent pay. More stability than I've had in years." He hesitated, then added, "What about you, Miss Palmer? What will you do now?" Elizabeth sighed, rocking gently in her chair. "I don't know. I can't go back to the ranch, not with Thomas there. Mrs. Holloway has offered me work here, but—" She hesitated. This isn't what I imagined for my life." "What did you imagine?" His question was gentle, genuinely curious. Elizabeth smiled sadly. "I always thought I'd marry someone kind, someone who loved the land as much as my father did. We'd have children, build something lasting together." She shook her head. "Foolish dreams, I suppose." "Not foolish at all," Matthew said, his voice low and reassuring. "Just delayed, perhaps." Their eyes met briefly in the fading light, and Elizabeth felt something stir within her, a warmth, a connection to this stranger who had risked his life to save hers. It was unexpected and slightly unsettling. The moment was broken by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Matthew straightened, his hand instinctively moving to his side where his gun would be, though he had left it in his room. Sheriff Donovan rode up to the boarding house, his expression grim. He dismounted and climbed the porch steps with heavy tread. "Evening, Miss Palmer, Mr. Morgan," he greeted them, removing his hat. "I'm afraid I have some troubling news." Elizabeth felt her stomach tighten with dread. "What is it?" "Thomas was seen heading out of town with those same 3 men from earlier," the sheriff said. "One of my deputies overheard them at the saloon before they left. Thomas was making all kinds of threats against both of you." Matthew's expression darkened. "Did they say where they were going?" "Back to the Palmer Ranch, most likely," the sheriff replied. "I'd ride out there myself, but I've got a situation with some cattle rustlers on the north side of the county that can't wait." He looked at Elizabeth apologetically. "I just wanted to warn you to be careful. Thomas has been drinking heavily, and those men he's with are not the kind you want to cross." Elizabeth nodded, her throat suddenly dry. "Thank you for the warning, Sheriff." After Donovan rode away, Elizabeth and Matthew stood in silence for a long moment, the beautiful sunset now forgotten. "I should get my things from the ranch," Elizabeth said finally, her voice barely audible. "There are things of my mother's, mementos I can't replace." Matthew studied her face in the gathering darkness. "It's not safe for you to go there." "I know, but I can't just abandon everything." She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly chilled despite the warm evening. "Besides, where else can I go? I can't hide at Mrs. Holloway's forever." Matthew was quiet for a moment, clearly wrestling with a decision. Finally, he said, "I'll take you to the ranch tomorrow. We'll get your belongings and then—" He hesitated. "Laramie isn't far. The Rocking J could always use a good cook if you're willing to work." Elizabeth stared at him, surprised by the offer. "You would do that for me? You barely know me." The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "I'm a pretty good judge of character, Miss Palmer, and something tells me you deserve better than what life's handed you lately." For the first time in months, Elizabeth felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, just the possibility of escape, of a fresh start, but it was more than she'd had this morning when Thomas had dragged her into town. "Thank you, Mr. Morgan," she said softly. "I would be grateful for the opportunity." As they stood there on the porch, with the last light of day fading into star-studded darkness, neither could have predicted the dangers that awaited them at the Palmer Ranch, or the bonds that would form as they faced those dangers together. Dawn broke over Promise Creek in a wash of pale gold and lavender. Elizabeth had barely slept, her mind racing with worry about facing Thomas, and the prospect of leaving the only home she'd ever known. She dressed carefully in her borrowed blue dress, and packed her few possessions in the small carpet bag Mrs. Holloway had lent her. Matthew was already in the dining room when she came downstairs, nursing a cup of coffee. He rose when she entered, and she was struck again by his imposing height and the quiet confidence he exuded. "Morning, Miss Palmer," he greeted her. "Mrs. Holloway has packed some biscuits and ham for the journey." Elizabeth smiled gratefully. "She's been so kind." "That she has," Matthew agreed, finishing his coffee. "I've arranged for a wagon from the livery, My horse can follow alongside." Mrs. Holloway bustled in with a wrapped package of food. "Now you take care, dear," she said, pressing the package into Elizabeth's hands. "And remember, there's always a place for you here if you need it." Elizabeth blinked back tears as she hugged the older woman. "Thank you for everything." Outside, the morning was clear and bright, with the promise of another hot summer day. The livery boy had brought around a simple wagon with a sturdy bay horse in the traces. Matthew's own mount, a magnificent dark stallion with a white blaze down his face, was tethered to the back. "That's a beautiful horse," Elizabeth commented as Matthew helped her up onto the wagon seat. "Thunderbolt," Matthew said with obvious affection. "Been with me through 5 states and more trouble than I care to remember." He swung up beside her and took the reins. "The ranch is east of town, you said," Elizabeth nodded, pointing toward the rising sun. "About 5 miles out, near Wolf Creek." As they left Promise Creek behind, Elizabeth felt a curious mixture of dread and anticipation. The familiar landscape, rolled by gently undulating grasslands dotted with sagebrush and occasional stands of pine where the land began to rise toward the distant mountains. "How long have you been on your own, Mr. Morgan?" she asked after they had traveled in companionable silence for a while. Matthew kept his eyes on the road. "Since the war ended. Went home to Virginia afterward, but there wasn't much left." His voice held old pain, carefully contained. "My parents had died during the fighting, the family farm was in ruins, and I wasn't the same man who left." "I'm sorry," Elizabeth said softly. Understanding all too well the grief of losing family, he glanced at her, something warm in his gaze. "It was a long time ago. I've made peace with it. And there was never anyone special, no one you wanted to settle down with." A shadow passed over his face. "There was someone once. She couldn't understand why I couldn't stay in one place, why I kept moving westward." He shrugged, as if dismissing the memory. "It was for the best. I wasn't ready then." Elizabeth nodded, sensing there was more to the story but respecting his privacy. "And now? Are you ready to settle in Laramie?" "I think so," he said, his voice thoughtful. "A man gets tired of drifting eventually, wants something to call his own, something to build." They crested a small rise, and Elizabeth pointed to a cluster of buildings nestled in a green valley beside a winding creek. "There it is, Palmer Ranch." From a distance, it looked peaceful, a modest but well-built house with a barn, corral, and several outbuildings. Smoke curled from the chimney, indicating someone was home. Matthew slowed the wagon, his expression becoming vigilant. "Are those your brother's horses in the corral?" Elizabeth squinted against the morning sun. "The bay and the pinto are ours. I don't recognize the others." A chill ran through her. Those must belong to the men who were with Thomas yesterday. Matthew's hand moved to his gun, ensuring it was loose in its holster. "We'll approach carefully. If there's any sign of trouble, you stay in the wagon, understand?" Elizabeth nodded, her mouth suddenly dry. As they drew closer to the ranch, she could see empty bottles scattered on the porch, evidence of Thomas's continued drinking. The place had a neglected air that pained her. Her father had always kept everything in perfect order. They were about 50 yards from the house when the front door swung open and Thomas stepped out, rifle in hand. Even from this distance, Elizabeth could tell he was unsteady on his feet. "That's far enough," Thomas shouted, raising the rifle to his shoulder. Matthew pulled the wagon to a halt, keeping his hands visible on the reins. "We're not looking for trouble, Palmer," he called back. "Your sister just came to collect her belongings." Thomas spat on the ground. "She's got nothing here that isn't mine by rights. Turn around and get off my property." Elizabeth's heart sank. She had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that Thomas might have sobered up and regained some sense of decency overnight. "Thomas, please," she called out. I only want Mother's locket and my clothes. I'll leave everything else." "Should have thought of that before you humiliated me in town," Thomas snarled. The front door opened wider, and the three men from the previous day emerged, all armed. "Now you two have a choice: leave now, or we start shooting." Matthew assessed the situation with calm precision. 4 armed men against just him. The odds weren't good. "What do you want to do?" he asked Elizabeth quietly, never taking his eyes off the men on the porch. Elizabeth's chest tightened with disappointment and anger. "I want my mother's things, but I won't have you shot over a locket and some dresses." Matthew nodded once, then called out to Thomas, "We're leaving. But this isn't over, Palmer." He began to turn the wagon when one of Thomas's companions, the bearded man who had tried to buy Elizabeth, raised his pistol and fired. The shot went wide, but the bay horse pulling the wagon reared in panic. Matthew reacted instantly. He pushed Elizabeth down below the wagon's edge and drew his own weapon in one fluid motion. His first shot caught the bearded man in the shoulder, spinning him backward. His second struck the porch post inches from Thomas's head, sending splinters flying. "Get down," Matthew ordered Elizabeth, leaping from the wagon as bullets began to fly from the house. Elizabeth crouched behind the wagon seat, heart pounding as gunfire erupted around her. She could hear Matthew returning fire from behind the wagon. The horses were whinnying in terror, threatening to bolt at any moment. Thomas and his companions had taken cover inside the house and were shooting from the windows. Glass shattered and wood splintered as bullets found the wagon. "Elizabeth," Matthew called from somewhere to her right. "When I give the word, run for the barn." "What about you?" she cried, flinching as another bullet thudded into the wagon beside her. "I'll cover you." Ready, before she could protest further, Matthew stood and fired 3 rapid shots at the house. "Now, run." Elizabeth gathered her skirts and sprinted toward the barn, expecting at any moment to feel the burning impact of a bullet in her back. She heard Matthew firing steadily behind her, keeping Thomas and his friends pinned down. She reached the barn and flung herself inside, gasping for breath. Moments later, Matthew backed in after her, reloading his pistol with practiced efficiency. "Are you hit?" he asked, his eyes quickly scanning her for injuries. Elizabeth shook her head, still trying to catch her breath. "No, I'm fine. You grazed my arm, nothing serious." He peered cautiously around the barn door. "They're still in the house, but they'll likely try to circle around soon." Elizabeth looked around the familiar space, the stalls where her father's horses had once stood, the hayloft where she had played as a child, the tack room where her mother's saddle still hung. It seemed impossible that this place of happy memories had become a battlefield. "There's a back door," she said, pointing to the far end of the barn. "It leads toward the creek. We could make a run for the trees." Matthew nodded. "Good thinking, but first—" He looked at her intently. "Is there anything in the house you absolutely cannot leave without? Your mother's locket?" Elizabeth hesitated. The silver locket with her parents' portraits inside was her most precious possession. "It's in my bedroom, in the small jewelry box on the dresser." "Which window is your bedroom?" Matthew asked, his mind clearly formulating a plan. "East side of the house, the one with the rose trellis beneath it." Matthew considered this information. "All right. New plan. We'll go out the back door, circle around to the east side. I'll boost you up to your window. You grab what you need quickly and we make a run for the trees." It was dangerous, but Elizabeth nodded her agreement. The thought of leaving without her mother's locket was unbearable. They slipped out the back door of the barn, staying low and using the outbuildings for cover. Gunfire had ceased temporarily, which worried Matthew more than reassured him. It meant Thomas and his friends were likely changing positions. They reached the east side of the house without incident. The rose trellis that Elizabeth's mother had planted years ago climbed the wall beneath her bedroom window. The window was closed but unbroken. "Quick now," Matthew whispered, lacing his fingers together to create a step for her foot. "In and out, nothing else." Elizabeth placed her boot in his hands and let him boost her up toward the window. She grasped the trellis for balance, wincing as thorns dug into her palms and pushed the window open. With one final heave from Matthew, she tumbled inside her bedroom. Everything was as she had left it: the simple iron bed with its patchwork quilt, the wooden dresser with her few personal items, the small bookshelf containing her treasured volumes. She rushed to the dresser and grabbed the silver jewelry box, opening it to confirm the locket was still inside. It was the oval silver pendant containing miniature portraits of her parents, attached to a delicate chain. Elizabeth quickly fastened it around her neck, then stuffed a few essential garments into a pillowcase. She was about to return to the window when the bedroom door burst open. Thomas stood in the doorway, his face contorted with rage and alcohol. "You little snake," he slurred, raising his pistol, "sneaking back into my house." Elizabeth's blood ran cold. "Thomas, please, I'm leaving. I just came for Mother's locket." "That locket's mine," he snarled, stepping forward unsteadily. "Everything here is mine. Pa left it all to me." "Not Mother's things," Elizabeth countered, backing toward the window. "You know he wanted me to have them." Thomas's bloodshot eyes narrowed. "Doesn't matter what he wanted. He's dead and I'm in charge now." He gestured with the gun. "Hand over the locket and maybe I'll let you walk out of here alive." Elizabeth's hand clutched the pendant at her throat. "No." Thomas took another step toward her, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Have it your way." Before he could fire, Matthew appeared at the window behind Elizabeth, his gun trained on Thomas. "Drop it, Palmer." Thomas's eyes widened in surprise, but his aim didn't waver. "You first, Cowboy." The standoff stretched for several tense heartbeats. Elizabeth could feel Matthew's presence behind her, solid and reassuring despite the danger. "Elizabeth," Matthew said quietly, "step to the side." She moved slowly to her right, keeping her eyes on her brother. Thomas tracked her movement with his gun, momentarily distracted. It was all the opening Matthew needed. His shot was precise, striking Thomas's gun hand and sending the weapon clattering to the floor. Thomas howled in pain, clutching his bleeding hand to his chest. "That's twice I've shot your hand," Matthew observed grimly. "Next time it won't be your hand." Elizabeth grabbed her pillowcase of belongings and moved toward the window. "This isn't over," Thomas growled, his face pale with pain and rage. "You're a dead man, Morgan, and you," he turned his venomous gaze to Elizabeth, "you're no sister of mine, not anymore." The words hurt more than they should have. Despite everything, Thomas was her only family. "Goodbye, Thomas," she said softly, then turned and climbed out the window. Matthew helped her down, and together they raced toward the tree line along Wolf Creek. They could hear shouting behind them as Thomas's companions responded to his cries, but they reached the cover of the trees before any shots were fired. "We need to keep moving," Matthew said as they waded across the shallow creek. "They'll come after us." Elizabeth nodded, clutching her makeshift bundle and trying to ignore the stinging scratches on her palms from the rose trellis. "There's a path through these woods that leads back to town. It's longer, but will be hidden." Matthew followed her lead as she navigated the familiar woodland trail. They moved quickly, listening for pursuers, but the forest remained quiet except for birdsong and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. After about an hour of steady walking, they paused in a small clearing to rest. Elizabeth sank down on a fallen log, the events of the morning catching up to her. Her hands were trembling. Matthew crouched beside her, his expression concerned. "Let me see your hands." She held them out, palms up, revealing the numerous small cuts from the rose thorns. Without a word, Matthew pulled a clean handkerchief from his pocket, dampened it with water from his canteen, and gently cleaned her wounds. "Thank you," Elizabeth said softly, watching his strong, capable hands work with surprising tenderness. "Not just for this, but for everything. You've risked your life for me twice now, and you barely know me." Matthew's eyes met hers, intense and honest. "Sometimes you just know when something's worth fighting for." The simple statement hung in the air between them, charged with meaning neither was ready to acknowledge. Elizabeth felt a flush rise to her cheeks and looked away first. "We should keep moving," she said, rising from the log. "It's still a few miles back to town." Matthew nodded, standing as well. "And then Laramie. The offer still stands." Elizabeth smiled, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders despite the danger they were still in. "Yes, I think I'd like that very much." As they continued through the forest, Elizabeth realized that for the first time since her father's death, she was moving towards something rather than simply running away. What that something might be, with this enigmatic cowboy by her side, remained to be seen, but for now, it was enough to have hope again. They reached Promise Creek by mid-afternoon, emerging from the woods on the eastern edge of town. Matthew insisted they go directly to the sheriff's office to report what had happened at the ranch. Sheriff Donovan listened gravely to their account. "Thomas has gone too far this time," he said, stroking his mustache thoughtfully. "Attempting to shoot his own sister. That's something I can act on. I'll ride out with some deputies and bring him in." "Be careful, Sheriff," Matthew warned. "He's got 3 men with him, all armed and likely still drinking." The sheriff nodded. "I appreciate the warning, Mr. Morgan. You two should leave town while I deal with this. Thomas knows where to find you here." Matthew glanced at Elizabeth. "We were planning to head to Laramie tomorrow." "Make it today," Sheriff Donovan advised. "I can't guarantee I'll find Thomas right away, and I'd rest easier knowing Miss Palmer was well away from here." They left the sheriff's office and returned to Mrs. Holloway's boarding house to collect their few belongings. The kind landlady was distressed to hear of their ordeal, but agreed that leaving immediately was the wisest course. "I'll have the cook pack you provisions for the journey," she insisted, bustling off to the kitchen. Elizabeth changed out of her torn and dirty dress into one of the garments she'd rescued from the ranch, a practical dark blue traveling dress that had belonged to her mother. She pinned her hair up securely and packed her mother's locket safely in her carpet bag, along with her other rescued possessions. When she came downstairs, Matthew was waiting in the foyer, his saddlebags slung over his shoulder. He had purchased a sturdy mare for Elizabeth from the livery stable, along with a proper saddle. "The wagon would slow us down too much," he explained as they stepped outside. "We can make better time on horseback." Elizabeth approached the mare, a gentle-looking chestnut with a white sock on her right foreleg. "She's beautiful," she said, stroking the horse's velvety nose. "Her name's Penny," Matthew said. "Liveryman says she's steady and sweet-tempered, good for a lady rider." Elizabeth felt a rush of gratitude. "You've thought of everything," Matthew shrugged, looking almost embarrassed. "It's a long ride to Laramie. Want you to be comfortable." Mrs. Holloway emerged from the boarding house with a sizable package wrapped in oilcloth. "Food for the journey," she explained, handing it to Matthew. "There's a farm about halfway to Laramie where you can stop for the night, the Wilsons. Tell them I sent you and they'll put you up." After heartfelt thanks and goodbyes, Elizabeth and Matthew mounted their horses and headed west out of Promise Creek. Elizabeth couldn't help looking back at the small town where she had spent her entire life, wondering if she would ever see it again. Having second thoughts, Matthew asked, noting her backward glance, Elizabeth shook her head. No, just saying goodbye. There are good memories here despite everything. Matthew nodded in understanding. First time I left Virginia, I felt the same way, but there's a whole world out there, Elizabeth. New memories to be made. It was the first time he had used her given name, and Elizabeth found she liked the sound of it on his lips. Yes, there is, she agreed, turning her face forward again, toward the setting sun and whatever future awaited them in Laramie. They rode steadily through the afternoon, following the well-traveled road that wound through rolling grasslands. The weather was warm but not oppressively hot, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of sage and wildflowers. Elizabeth was a competent rider, having grown up on a ranch, and Penny proved to be as steady and comfortable as promised. They rode side by side when the trail allowed, and Matthew shared stories of his travels, the majestic mountains of Montana, the endless plains of Kansas, the rugged beauty of Colorado. As dusk approached, they spotted the Wilson farm, a prosperous-looking homestead with fields of corn and wheat surrounding a substantial two-story house and large barn. Farmer Wilson and his wife welcomed them warmly upon hearing Mrs. Holloway's name. After a hearty dinner, Elizabeth was shown to a small but comfortable bedroom, while Matthew was given a cot in the barn. Despite her exhaustion, Elizabeth found sleep elusive. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw Thomas's rage-contorted face and heard his final words to her. "You're no sister of mine. Not anymore." The finality of the break with her only remaining family member weighed heavily on her heart. When dawn came, she rose and dressed quickly, eager to be on the road again. Mrs. Wilson provided a breakfast of eggs, bacon, and fresh bread, then packed them another parcel of food for the day's journey. "Laramie's about 6 hours' ride from here," Farmer Wilson told them as they prepared to depart. "You should make it well before nightfall if you keep a steady pace." The second day of travel was as pleasant as the first. As they rode, Elizabeth found herself studying Matthew when he wasn't looking, the strong line of his jaw, the way the wind ruffled his dark hair, the capable hands that held the reins so confidently. There was something compelling about him beyond his handsome features, a quiet strength, an unwavering sense of honor, and beneath his reserved exterior, a kindness that touched her deeply. He had risked everything for a woman he barely knew, asking nothing in return. They stopped at midday beside a small stream to rest the horses and eat some of Mrs. Wilson's provisions. As they sat in the shade of a cottonwood tree, Elizabeth finally asked the question that had been on her mind. "Why did you really help me, Matthew? The truth." He looked surprised at the direct question, then thoughtful. "When I rode into Promise Creek and saw what was happening, I've seen that kind of thing before, men treating women like property, like they're less than human." His expression hardened momentarily. "My sister was treated that way by her husband. I wasn't there to protect her then. I couldn't ride past and let it happen to you." Elizabeth's breath caught. "I didn't know you had a sister." Matthew's eyes held old pain. "Emily. She married young to a man who seemed decent enough at first. I was away fighting in the war when things went bad. By the time I got home, she was gone, died from a beating he gave her." "I'm so sorry," Elizabeth whispered, reaching out to touch his hand. He turned his palm upward, his fingers curling around hers. "Her husband never faced justice. He disappeared before I could find him. Since then, I've never been able to stand by when I see a woman being mistreated." The revelation explained so much about his immediate, unwavering defense of her. Elizabeth felt a deeper connection forming between them, built on shared loss and understanding. "Thank you for telling me," she said softly, "and for being the kind of man who still believes in justice, even when the world is unfair." Matthew's eyes met hers, something warm and unguarded in his gaze. For a moment, Elizabeth thought he might lean forward, might close the distance between them, but instead, he gently released her hand and stood. "We should keep riding if we want to reach Laramie before dark," he said, his voice slightly rougher than before. They packed up their small picnic and continued westward. The landscape began to change subtly, the rolling grasslands giving way to more rugged terrain as they approached the foothills of the Laramie Mountains. By late afternoon, they crested a rise and saw the town of Laramie spread before them in the valley below, larger than Promise Creek, with numerous buildings clustered along its main street and wisps of smoke rising from chimneys against the backdrop of the mountains beyond. "There it is," Matthew said, pulling Thunderbolt to a halt beside her. "Laramie, population about 2,000 according to my new employer." Elizabeth took in the view, a mixture of excitement and apprehension filling her. This would be her new home, a place where no one knew her or her troubled history with Thomas. A fresh start. "It's beautiful," she said, taking in the panoramic view. Matthew nodded in agreement. "The Rocking J Ranch is about 3 miles north of town. We can stop in Laramie first if you like, get a proper meal, maybe some new clothes for you." "I'd like that," Elizabeth replied with a smile. After days on the road, the prospect of a hot bath and fresh clothing was enormously appealing. They rode into Laramie as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the busy streets. Laramie was indeed much larger and more developed than Promise Creek, boasting a proper hotel, several saloons, a bank, a school, and numerous shops along its main thoroughfare. Matthew led them to the Western Star Hotel, a respectable-looking 3-story building with a wide front porch. He dismounted and helped Elizabeth down from Penny, then secured both horses to the hitching post. "Wait here," he said. "I'll see about rooms." Elizabeth nodded, suddenly conscious of her travel-worn appearance as elegantly dressed women passed by on the boardwalk. She smoothed her wrinkled skirt and tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, feeling distinctly out of place. Matthew returned a few minutes later with keys in hand. "They had 2 rooms available. I've arranged for a bath to be brought up to yours." He hesitated, then added, "There's a dress shop across the street that's still open. If you'd like, we could go there before dinner." Elizabeth felt a rush of gratitude for his thoughtfulness. "That would be wonderful, thank you." The dress shop owner, a plump, cheerful woman named Mrs. Fletcher, clucked sympathetically when Elizabeth explained she had lost most of her belongings. "You poor dear. Let's get you sorted right away," she said, ushering Elizabeth toward the back of the shop where several ready-made dresses hung on display. "What's the occasion?" "Just everyday wear or something special?" "Everyday wear mostly," Elizabeth replied. "I'll be working on a ranch." "The Rocking J," Matthew added from where he stood awkwardly near the door. "She'll be the new cook." Mrs. Fletcher's eyes lit up with recognition. "Oh, you must be Mr. Morgan, the new foreman. Mr. Jenkins mentioned you'd be arriving this week." She turned to Elizabeth with newfound interest. "And you're to be the cook. How wonderful." The old cook left months ago, and they've been making do with ranch hands taking turns in the kitchen with predictably disastrous results, from what I hear. Elizabeth smiled, heartened by the friendly reception. "I hope I can improve the situation." "I'm sure you will, dear Mrs. Fletcher said warmly. "Now, for ranch work, you'll need sturdy, practical clothing." She began selecting garments from the racks, 2 everyday dresses in serviceable fabrics, a warmer woolen dress for cooler weather, several shirtwaists and skirts that could be mixed and matched, and the necessary undergarments. Matthew discreetly stepped outside while Elizabeth tried on the clothing, returning only when Mrs. Fletcher called that they were finished. The total came to more than Elizabeth expected, and she hesitated, suddenly realizing she had very little money of her own. Matthew noticed her discomfort and stepped forward. "Please add it to my account, Mrs. Fletcher. Mr. Jenkins can take it from my first month's wages." "Oh, I couldn't possibly." Elizabeth began to protest, but Matthew silenced her with a gentle look. "Consider it an advance on your salary," he said quietly. "You can pay me back once you start working." Mrs. Fletcher beamed at them both. "Isn't that gentlemanly? You're a fortunate young lady, Miss Palmer." Elizabeth felt a blush rise to her cheeks, but didn't correct the shopkeeper's assumption about their relationship. It was simpler this way, and they would be working together on the ranch soon enough. With her new clothing wrapped in paper parcels, they returned to the hotel. Elizabeth gratefully retreated to her room where a copper tub of steaming water awaited her. The hot bath was pure bliss after days of travel, washing away not only the dust of the trail, but some of the emotional weight of her ordeal with Thomas. She dressed in one of her new outfits, a pretty light blue calico dress with white trim, and arranged her hair neatly, securing it with the tortoiseshell combs that had been her mother's. Around her neck, she fastened the silver locket containing her parents' portraits, drawing strength from their remembered love. When she met Matthew in the hotel dining room, his appreciative gaze made her pulse quicken. He had also bathed and changed, wearing a clean white shirt and dark vest that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders. "You look lovely," he said simply as he held her chair. "Thank you," Elizabeth replied, feeling suddenly shy. "You clean up rather well yourself." Dinner was the finest meal Elizabeth had enjoyed in months. Tender beefsteak, fresh vegetables, and apple pie for dessert. As they ate, Matthew told her more about the Rocking J Ranch and its owner, Harold Jenkins. "He's in his 70s now, built the ranch from nothing after the war. His wife died last year and his children have all moved back east. He needs help running the place but doesn't want to sell." Matthew took a sip of coffee. "That's where I come in, managing the day-to-day operations, the cattle, the hands." "And what about me?" Elizabeth asked. "Will I just be cooking, or are there other duties?" "Cooking primarily, but also keeping the main house in order. Mr. Jenkins lives there alone now, apart from a young man named Bobby who helps with odd jobs around the place." Matthew smiled. "From what I've been told, they've been surviving on beans and biscuits since the last cook left. They'll probably weep with joy when they taste real food again." Elizabeth laughed, her first genuine laugh in what felt like ages. "I'll do my best not to disappoint them." After dinner, they stepped out onto the hotel's veranda to enjoy the cool evening air. Laramie was still busy despite the late hour, with people moving between saloons and shop lights glowing warmly against the gathering darkness. "It's so different from Promise Creek," Elizabeth observed. "So much larger, more alive." Matthew nodded, leaning against the porch railing beside her. "Laramie's growing fast. The railroad's been here a few years now, bringing new people all the time." "Do you think you'll stay?" Elizabeth asked, glancing at his profile in the lamplight. "After all your traveling, will the Rocking J be home?" Matthew was quiet for a moment, considering. "I'd like it to be," he said finally. "I'm tired of drifting, of never belonging anywhere." He turned to look at her. "What about you? Is this just a temporary stop on your journey?" Elizabeth hadn't thought that far ahead. The past few days had been about escape, survival, but now, standing in this new place beside this man who had risked everything for her, she felt something she hadn't expected possibility. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "But I'd like to find out what it feels like to belong somewhere again." Their eyes met and held in the soft lamplight. Something shifted between them, the tentative connection that had been building through danger and shared confidences deepening into something more profound. Matthew took a half-step closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Elizabeth, he was interrupted by a loud commotion from the street shouting, the sound of breaking glass, and then a gunshot. They both turned toward the noise, the moment broken. A brawl had erupted outside one of the saloons, spilling into the street. Two men were grappling in the dust while others cheered them on. The town marshal and his deputy were hurrying toward the disturbance. "Perhaps we should go inside," Matthew suggested, his hand coming to rest lightly on the small of Elizabeth's back. She nodded, disappointed by the interruption but also relieved. Whatever had been about to happen between them, whatever Matthew had been about to say, it was perhaps too soon, too fragile to withstand the harsh light of examination. They said their good nights in the hotel corridor, Matthew pausing outside her door. "We'll head to the ranch in the morning if that suits you," he said. "Mr. Jenkins is expecting us." "That sounds perfect," Elizabeth replied, suddenly aware of how close they were standing in the narrow hallway. "Good night, Matthew, and thank you again for everything." He tipped his hat slightly, his eyes warm. "Good night, Elizabeth. Sleep well." Inside her room, Elizabeth leaned against the closed door, her heart beating a rapid tattoo against her ribs. In the span of just a few days, her entire life had been upended. She had lost her home, broken ties with her only family, and traveled to a new town with a man who was still largely a stranger to her. And yet, despite the uncertainty, she felt more hope than she had in months. Tomorrow would bring a new beginning at the Rocking J Ranch, and perhaps, with time, something more with the quiet, honorable cowboy who had saved her in more ways than one. The morning brought clear skies and the promise of a warm day as Elizabeth and Matthew set out for the Rocking J Ranch. They rode north from Laramie, following a well-maintained road that wound through rolling grasslands dotted with wildflowers. "There it is," Matthew said after they had been riding for about an hour, pointing to a sprawling ranch that came into view as they crested a rise. "The Rocking J." Elizabeth took in the impressive sight. The ranch was far larger than her family's modest property, a substantial two-story main house painted white with green shutters, a massive barn, bunkhouse, cookhouse, corral, and numerous outbuildings spread across the valley floor. Herds of cattle grazed on the lush grasslands beyond, and in the distance, the Laramie Mountains provided a majestic backdrop. "It's beautiful," she said, genuinely impressed. As they approached, a figure emerged from the main house, an elderly man with a shock of white hair and a neat beard, leaning on a carved walking stick. Despite his obvious age, he stood straight and watched their approach with keen eyes. "That'll be Mr. Jenkins," Matthew said, a note of respect in his voice. They dismounted in front of the house, and Matthew stepped forward to greet his new employer. "Mr. Jenkins, sir. Matthew Morgan, reporting as arranged." The old rancher extended a gnarled hand. "Right on time, Morgan. I appreciate punctuality in a foreman." His sharp blue eyes moved to Elizabeth. "And who might this young lady be?" "Elizabeth Palmer, sir," Matthew replied. "The cook I mentioned in my letter. She's highly skilled and in need of a position." Mr. Jenkins assessed Elizabeth with a penetrating gaze that seemed to take in everything about her in an instant. "Can you make a decent apple pie, Miss Palmer?" The question was so unexpected that Elizabeth couldn't help but smile. "Yes, sir. My mother's recipe won blue ribbons at the county fair 3 years running." A slow smile spread across the old man's weathered face. "Then you're hired. Come inside, both of you. We've got matters to discuss." The interior of the main house was spacious and well-appointed, though it showed signs of needing a woman's touch: dust on the mantelpiece, curtains hanging unevenly, and a general air of bachelor neglect. Mr. Jenkins led them to a comfortable sitting room where a young man with a slight limp was attempting to build a fire in the large stone fireplace. "Bobby," Mr. Jenkins called, "come meet our new foreman and cook." The young man, no more than 16 or 17, looked up with a bright, open face. "Really? A real cook? No more of Hank's burned biscuits?" He scrambled to his feet and approached them eagerly, extending a hand first to Matthew, then to Elizabeth. "Bobby Wilson, madam. I help around the house and with the horses. It's real nice to meet you both." Elizabeth warmed to the boy immediately. "It's lovely to meet you too, Bobby." They settled into chairs while Bobby brought coffee. Mr. Jenkins wasted no time getting down to business. "Morgan, I've got 20,000 acres, 1,500 head of cattle, and 18 ranch hands who need firm leadership. The last foreman let things slide, discipline got lax, fences went unrepaired, and we lost too many calves to predators last spring." He fixed Matthew with a serious look. "I need you to whip things back into shape." "I understand, sir," Matthew replied confidently. "I'll start by riding the property today, assessing what needs immediate attention." Mr. Jenkins nodded approvingly, then turned to Elizabeth. "As for you, Miss Palmer, the cookhouse is yours to command. 3 meals a day for the hands, and you'll also be responsible for keeping this house in order. My wife, God rest her soul, always said a house needs a woman's touch to truly be a home. I'd be honored to help restore it to what she would have wanted," Elizabeth said sincerely. The old rancher's eyes softened momentarily. "Martha would have liked you, I think." He cleared his throat and continued more briskly. "Bobby will show you to your accommodations. Miss Palmer, there's a small cottage behind the main house that served as the cook's residence. It's been vacant for some months, but should be comfortable enough once it's aired out." After finishing their coffee, Bobby eagerly led them on a tour of the ranch. The bunkhouse was a long, low building where the ranch hands slept. The cookhouse beside it contained a large kitchen with a massive iron stove and a dining area that could seat all the workers at once. The barn was impressive, spacious, and well built, with stalls for numerous horses and storage for hay and equipment. Finally, they came to Elizabeth's cottage, a neat, one-room structure with a small porch. Inside was simple but adequate. A bed, a dresser, a small table with 2 chairs, a tiny stove for heat, and a bookshelf with a few abandoned volumes. A colorful quilt covered the bed, and curtains framed the 2 windows that let in ample light. "Mrs. Jenkins made those curtains herself," Bobby informed them proudly. "Mr. Jenkins couldn't bear to take them down after she passed." Elizabeth ran her fingers over the neatly stitched fabric. "They're beautiful. I'll take good care of them." While Bobby showed Elizabeth the cookhouse, Matthew went to meet the ranch hands who were returning for their midday meal. Most were typical cowboys, rugged, weather-beaten men ranging in age from their 20s to their 50s, with the easy confidence of those who spent their lives on horseback. By the time Elizabeth had familiarized herself with the cookhouse and checked the pantry supplies, it was nearly noon. The previous cook had left the kitchen reasonably well stocked with staples, and a vegetable garden behind the cookhouse provided fresh produce. There was salt pork in the smokehouse and freshly butchered beef hanging in the cool cellar beneath the cookhouse floor. "What would you like me to prepare for the men's dinner?" she asked Mr. Jenkins, who had joined them in the cookhouse. "Whatever you can manage on short notice," he replied. "They've been living on burnt biscuits and watery stew for months. Anything you make will seem like a feast." Elizabeth rolled up her sleeves and set to work. She quickly prepared a hearty meal of beef stew, cornbread, and apple cobbler, working with Bobby's enthusiastic but somewhat clumsy assistance. When the dinner bell rang, the ranch hands filed in, eyeing her curiously as they took their seats at the long tables. Matthew entered last, having spent the afternoon touring the property with the most experienced hand, a grizzled cowboy named Sam. "Men," Mr. Jenkins announced from the head of the table, "this is Miss Palmer, your new cook, and Mr. Morgan, your new foreman. I expect you to show them both the respect they deserve." The meal was received with enthusiasm bordering on reverence. One older cowboy actually removed his hat and placed it over his heart after tasting the cobbler, declaring it a religious experience. Elizabeth felt a blush of pleasure at the appreciation of her cooking, which had been one of the few aspects of running the Palmer household that she had truly enjoyed. After dinner, as Elizabeth was cleaning up with Bobby's help, Matthew stopped by the kitchen. "The men can't stop talking about your cooking," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "I think you've won them over already." Elizabeth smiled, wiping her hands on her apron. "Food is the quickest way to a man's loyalty, my father always said." "Smart man," Matthew replied, his eyes warm as they rested on her. "I've been talking with Mr. Jenkins. He wants me to ride the north boundary tomorrow with Sam and a few of the hands. Apparently there's been some trouble with fence cutting." "Rustlers?" Elizabeth asked, alarmed. Matthew nodded grimly. "Possibly. They've lost some cattle over the past few months. I'll be gone most of the day, but I should be back by supper." "Be careful," Elizabeth said, surprised by how quickly concern for his safety had become natural to her. "Always am," he assured her with a slight smile. "Good night, Elizabeth." "Good night, Matthew." As she settled into her cottage that evening, Elizabeth felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in months. The small space was already beginning to feel like home. She had unpacked her few belongings, hung her dresses in the small wardrobe, and placed her mother's silver-backed hairbrush on the dresser. The locket containing her parents' portraits rested on the table beside her bed, where she could see it first thing each morning. The cottage windows stood open to the mild summer night, letting in the soothing sounds of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle. From her porch, she could see the lights of the main house and, further away, the yellow glow from the bunkhouse windows where the cowboys were likely playing cards or sharing stories before turning in. For the first time since her father's death, Elizabeth felt truly safe. The rocking J already seemed like a haven, a place where she could rebuild her life free from Thomas's cruelty and the painful memories of Promise Creek. As she drifted off to sleep in the unfamiliar bed, her last conscious thought was of Matthew, his quiet strength, his unwavering honor, and the way his eyes softened when they rested on her. She wasn't ready to name the feeling stirring within her, but she knew with certainty that meeting Matthew Morgan had changed the course of her life in ways she was only beginning to understand. Over the next few weeks, Elizabeth settled into life at the Rocking J with surprising ease. The rhythms of ranch life were familiar and comforting, rising before dawn to start breakfast for the hands, planning and preparing the midday and evening meals, keeping the main house clean and orderly for Mr. Jenkins. The old rancher proved to be a kind employer, gruff but fair, with a dry wit that often caught her by surprise. He treated her with unfailing respect and seemed genuinely appreciative of both her cooking and her efforts to restore his home to the standard his late wife had maintained. Bobby became something of an assistant to Elizabeth, eagerly helping in the kitchen and garden when he wasn't busy with his other duties. His cheerful nature and innocent enthusiasm were infectious, and Elizabeth found herself growing fond of the boy, whose own story, orphaned at 12 and taken in by Mr. Jenkins out of respect for his late father, who had been one of the rancher's oldest friends, had touched her deeply. As for Matthew, he had thrown himself into his role as foreman with characteristic dedication. The ranch hands, initially wary of their new boss, had quickly come to respect his fair leadership, technical knowledge and willingness to work alongside them on the most challenging tasks. Elizabeth saw him primarily at mealtimes, when he would join the other men in the cookhouse, always offering a quiet word of appreciation for her cooking. Occasionally, their paths would cross in the main house when Matthew was reporting to Mr. Jenkins, or in the evenings when he sometimes stopped by her cottage to check that she had everything she needed. These brief interactions were charged with an unspoken awareness that had been growing between them since their journey from Promise Creek. Elizabeth found herself looking forward to these moments, the brief touch of his hand as he helped her down from a wagon, the way his eyes sought hers across the crowded cookhouse, the rare but treasured occasions when he would linger on her porch in the evening, sharing stories of his day as the stars emerged above them. One such evening, about a month after their arrival at the Rocking J, Matthew appeared at her door just as twilight was fading into true darkness. Elizabeth had been sitting on her porch, enjoying the cool night air after a hot day in the cookhouse. "Evening, Elizabeth," he greeted her, hat in hand. "Hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all," she replied, gesturing to the empty chair beside her. "Please join me." He settled into the chair with a weary sigh. Elizabeth noticed the lines of fatigue around his eyes and the dust coating his clothes. "Long day?" she asked. "Very. We've been moving cattle to the north pasture. One of the younger hands got himself thrown and nearly trampled." Matthew ran a hand through his hair, leaving it charmingly disheveled. "He'll be all right, but it was a close call." "Is that why you're so late for supper? I saved you a plate. It's keeping warm in the oven." A grateful smile spread across his face. "That's very thoughtful of you." "I'm sorry I missed dinner. There was no time to get back." "There's no need to apologize," Elizabeth assured him. "Your work is important." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, distant cattle, the occasional whinny of a horse, laughter drifting from the bunkhouse. "You seem happy here," Matthew observed, his eyes studying her face in the soft glow spilling from the cottage window. Elizabeth smiled. "I am. Happier than I've been in a long time." She hesitated, then added honestly, "I still think about Thomas sometimes, wonder what became of him after we left." Matthew's expression grew serious. "I received a letter from Sheriff Donovan yesterday." "I was waiting for the right moment to tell you." Elizabeth's heart quickened. "What did it say?" "Thomas was arrested the day after we left Promise Creek. The sheriff found him at your ranch with those same 3 men, all of them drunk and dangerous. There was a confrontation." Matthew paused. "Thomas drew on the sheriff. Donovan had no choice but to shoot. I'm sorry, Elizabeth, but your brother is dead." Elizabeth closed her eyes, a complex wave of emotions washing over her: grief for the brother she had once loved, relief that she would never again have to fear him, guilt for feeling that relief. "I'm not surprised," she said finally, opening her eyes to find Matthew watching her with concern. "Thomas changed after Pa died. It was like something broke inside him, something vital that kept his darker nature in check." Matthew reached across the space between them to take her hand. "I'm sorry for your loss. Despite everything he did, he was still your family." Elizabeth squeezed his hand gratefully. "Thank you for understanding and for telling me." She took a deep breath, feeling as if a chapter in her life had finally closed. "What else did the sheriff say?" "The Palmer Ranch has been seized for unpaid taxes. There will be an auction next month." Matthew hesitated. "If there's anything there you want, anything that belonged to your parents." Elizabeth shook her head. "I have what matters most: Mother's locket, Pa's Bible, the quilt Mother made for my bed. The rest is just things." She managed a small smile. "My life is here now." Their eyes met and held in the darkness. Matthew's thumb traced gentle circles on the back of her hand, sending a shiver up her arm. "I'm glad," he said simply. The moment stretched between them, fragile and significant. Elizabeth found herself acutely aware of his closeness, of the warmth of his hand holding hers, of the way his eyes reflected the starlight. "Elizabeth," he began, his voice lower than before, "I've been meaning to tell you." He was interrupted by Bobby's voice calling from the direction of the main house. "Mr. Morgan, Mr. Jenkins needs to see you right away." The moment shattered. Matthew released her hand and stood, turning toward the boy who was hurrying toward them through the darkness. "What's happened, Bobby?" "Ryder just came in from the Larson place," Bobby panted, having clearly run all the way. "Says there's a gang of rustlers hitting ranches in the area. They hit the Larson spread tonight, stole 50 head, and shot one of their hands who tried to stop them." Matthew's expression hardened. "Tell Mr. Jenkins I'll be right there." As Bobby raced back to the house, Matthew turned to Elizabeth. "I'm sorry I have to go." "Of course," she said, rising as well. "Be careful, Matthew." He nodded, his eyes lingering on her face for a moment longer before he turned and strode quickly toward the main house, leaving Elizabeth standing alone on her porch, her hand still warm from his touch, and her mind filled with questions about what he had been about to say. The rustlers became the primary concern of everyone at the Rocking J over the following days. Matthew organized the hands into extra patrols, particularly around the northern boundary where the Larson ranch had been hit. Mr. Jenkins sent word to neighboring ranchers, and they agreed to share information and assist each other if the rustlers struck again. Elizabeth found herself worrying constantly about Matthew, who was working longer hours than ever, often returning to the ranch well after dark, exhausted but determined to protect the Rocking J and its cattle. A week after the news of the Larson raid, Elizabeth was in the main house, dusting Mr. Jenkins's collection of leather-bound books, when the old rancher entered the study. "You're doing a fine job here, Miss Palmer," he said, settling into his favorite armchair by the window. "The house hasn't looked this good since Martha passed." "Thank you, sir," Elizabeth replied, pleased by the compliment. "I've tried to keep things as she would have wanted them." Mr. Jenkins nodded approvingly, then changed the subject with characteristic abruptness. "Morgan's a good man." The non sequitur caught Elizabeth off guard. "Yes, he is," she agreed carefully. "He's an excellent foreman." A knowing smile crossed the old man's face. "That he is, but that's not what I meant, and I think you know it." He gestured for her to sit in the chair opposite him. "Come, sit a moment. My old bones aren't up for standing through conversations these days." Elizabeth obediently sat, wondering where this was leading. "I've been watching you too," Mr. Jenkins continued. "The way you look at each other when you think no one notices. Reminds me of how Martha and I were in the beginning." Elizabeth felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Mr. Jenkins, he waved away her protest. "No need to be embarrassed, my dear. At my age, one of the few pleasures left is observing life unfold around you." His blue eyes, still sharp despite his years, studied her face. "He cares for you deeply, you know." "We've been through a great deal together," Elizabeth said cautiously. "Yes, so I've gathered from the bits and pieces I've heard." "He rescued you from some sort of trouble back in Promise Creek, didn't he?" Elizabeth nodded, not wanting to go into the painful details. "He did, at considerable risk to himself." Mr. Jenkins leaned forward slightly. "And now you're both here, rebuilding your lives. It seems to me that's no mere coincidence." "What are you suggesting, sir?" Elizabeth asked, though she suspected she knew. The old rancher's expression softened. "Only that life is short, my dear, and happiness is rare and precious. When you find someone who looks at you the way Morgan looks at you, well, that's not something to take lightly. Before Elizabeth could respond, they heard the front door open, followed by the sound of boots in the hallway. A moment later, Matthew appeared in the doorway, his expression grim. "Sorry to interrupt, sir, but we've got trouble. Rustlers hit the Peterson place last night. 2 hands dead, 100 head of cattle stolen." Mr. Jenkins's face darkened. "That's too close for comfort. What are we doing about it?" "I've doubled the night patrols and sent word to the marshal in Laramie. He's organizing a posse to track them down." Matthew's eyes flickered to Elizabeth, concern evident in his gaze. "I'd like to station a couple of men near the house at night, just as a precaution." "Do what you think best," Mr. Jenkins agreed, rising from his chair with the aid of his walking stick. "I'll get my rifle from the cabinet. Haven't had to use it in years, but I can still shoot straight if I need to." After the old rancher left the room, Matthew turned to Elizabeth. "I don't want to alarm you, but these rustlers are dangerous. They don't hesitate to kill." Elizabeth nodded, her throat suddenly dry. "Do you think they'll come here? The Rocking J is the largest spread in the area. It would be a tempting target." He moved closer, his voice dropping to ensure they weren't overheard. "Promise me you'll be careful. Keep your doors locked at night, and if you hear anything unusual, anything at all, go straight to the main house." "I promise," she said, touched by his concern. He held her gaze for a long moment, and Elizabeth was acutely aware of their proximity in the quiet study. "I couldn't bear it if anything happened to you," he said softly. The simple statement, spoken with such raw honesty, made Elizabeth's heart quicken. "Nothing will happen," she assured him, instinctively reaching out to touch his arm. "I trust you to keep us all safe." The weight of that trust was visible in his eyes, pride mixed with determination, and something deeper that made her breath catch. For an instant, she thought he might close the distance between them, but the sound of Mr. Jenkins returning broke the moment. "I need to get back to the men," Matthew said, stepping away. "We're organizing the night patrols." As he left, Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling that time was somehow running out, that the peaceful interlude they had enjoyed at the Rocking J was coming to an end, and decisions would soon need to be made that would shape all their futures. The next few days passed in a state of heightened vigilance. The ranch hands were armed and alert, patrolling the property in shifts. Elizabeth continued her duties as normal, but there was an undercurrent of tension in every interaction, every moment. Matthew was rarely at the main house, spending most of his time with the hands in the fields or riding the boundaries. When she did see him, he looked exhausted but resolute, the responsibility of protecting the ranch and its people weighing heavily on him. 4 days after the news of the Peterson raid, Elizabeth was awakened in the middle of the night by the sound of gunfire. She sat bolt upright in bed, her heart pounding, as more shots echoed in the darkness. Remembering her promise to Matthew, she quickly pulled on a robe over her nightgown, thrust her feet into boots, and grabbed her father's old pistol from the drawer beside her bed. With shaking hands, she checked that it was loaded, then cautiously opened her door. The night was chaos, men shouting, horses whinnying in distress, more gunshots from the direction of the north pasture. Lanterns were being lit in the bunkhouse, and she could see figures running toward the commotion. Elizabeth hesitated only a moment before hurrying toward the main house as she had promised. Halfway there, a figure emerged from the shadows, and she nearly screamed before recognizing Bobby. "Miss Palmer," the boy gasped, his young face pale in the moonlight. "The rustlers are here. Mr. Morgan told me to make sure you got to the main house safely." "Where is he?" Elizabeth asked, allowing Bobby to guide her toward the house at a run. "Fighting with the rustlers by the North Corral," Bobby replied, his voice trembling with fear and excitement. "There's at least a dozen of them, maybe more. They reached the main house to find Mr. Jenkins in the doorway, rifle in hand. "Inside, both of you," he ordered, ushering them through the door. "Bobby, bolt the windows. Miss Palmer, there's another rifle in the gun cabinet if you know how to use it." "My father taught me," Elizabeth said, moving to the cabinet and extracting a Winchester repeating rifle. Mr. Jenkins nodded approvingly. "Good girl. Let's hope we don't need to use them, but if those rustlers come near the house." The unspoken threat hung in the air as they secured the house as best they could. Through the windows, they could see the distant flashes of gunfire and hear the shouts and the thundering of hooves as cattle were being driven off. "Shouldn't we go help?" Bobby asked, his young face etched with worry. "Mr. Morgan and the others might need us." "Our job is to protect the house," Mr. Jenkins said firmly. "Morgan knows what he's doing. He's got all but 2 of the hands with him. The best we can do is stay put and be ready if the fight comes to us." The waiting was excruciating. Elizabeth stationed herself at a front window, rifle ready, straining to see what was happening in the darkness beyond. The gunfire seemed to be moving further away, suggesting the rustlers were being driven back, or perhaps they were retreating with their stolen cattle. After what seemed like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, there was a pounding at the front door. "Mr. Jenkins, it's Sam. We need help." The old rancher moved to the door but kept his rifle ready. "Identify yourself properly, man." "Samuel Tucker, been working for you for 15 years, came the reply. "For God's sake, open up. Morgan's been shot." Elizabeth's blood ran cold. She rushed to the door as Mr. Jenkins unbolted it, revealing Sam and another hand supporting Matthew between them, his shirt dark with blood. "Get him to the sofa," Mr. Jenkins ordered, his voice steady despite the alarming sight. "Bobby, fetch my medicine chest from the study. Miss Palmer will need hot water and clean cloths." Elizabeth forced herself to remain calm as she hurried to the kitchen to heat water. Inside, she was terrified Matthew looked so pale and there was so much blood. She worked quickly, stoking the kitchen stove and setting a kettle to boil, then gathering all the clean linen she could find. When she returned to the parlor, they had laid Matthew on the sofa. Mr. Jenkins had cut away his shirt to reveal a bullet wound in his left shoulder, bleeding steadily. "How bad is it?" Elizabeth asked, setting down the basin of water and cloths. "Bullet went through clean," Sam reported grimly, "but he's lost a lot of blood." Mr. Jenkins was already examining the wound with experienced hands. "I've seen worse in the war. If we can stop the bleeding and prevent infection, he should recover." He looked up at Elizabeth. "You've steady hands, Miss Palmer. I need you to help me clean and bandage this wound." Elizabeth nodded, pushing aside her fear to focus on the task. She knelt beside the sofa and gently began cleaning the blood from around the wound, trying not to flinch at Matthew's occasional groans of pain. "What happened?" Mr. Jenkins asked Sam, who was standing nearby with his hat in his hands. "Rustlers tried to take the north herd," Sam reported. "We were ready for them, had men positioned in the trees. We got the drop on them, but they fought hard. Morgan took a bullet protecting young Jimmy, who got caught in the open." He shook his head admiringly. "Never seen a man move so fast, pushed the boy out of the way and took the shot himself." "Did you stop them?" Mr. Jenkins asked, carefully applying a poultice of herbs to the wound. "Yes, sir. They ran off without getting any cattle. We wounded at least 3 of them, maybe killed 1. They won't be back, not after the fight we gave them." Sam's weathered face broke into a grim smile. "Morgan organized us real good. Every man knew exactly where to be and what to do." "Any other injuries on our side?" Pete took a graze to his leg, nothing serious. "Everyone else is fine, thanks to Morgan's quick thinking." As they spoke, Elizabeth continued to tend to Matthew, her heart aching at his pained expression. His eyes fluttered open briefly, unfocused with pain and blood loss. "Elizabeth," he murmured, trying to reach for her with his good arm. "I'm here," she said softly, taking his hand. "Lie still. You've been shot, but you're going to be all right." He seemed to relax at her touch, his eyes closing again as Mr. Jenkins prepared to bandage the wound. "He needs rest now," the old rancher said, expertly wrapping clean bandages around Matthew's shoulder. "And someone should stay with him through the night to watch for fever." "I'll stay," Elizabeth said immediately, still holding Matthew's hand. Mr. Jenkins nodded as if he had expected nothing less. "Bobby, bring blankets and pillows for Miss Palmer. She'll be spending the night in this chair." He turned to Sam. "Get the men organized for the rest of the night. Double the patrols, just in case those rustlers are foolish enough to try again." As the others left to carry out their tasks, Elizabeth remained by Matthew's side, gently stroking his hand. In the quiet of the parlor, with only the ticking of the clock and Matthew's labored breathing to break the silence, she allowed herself to acknowledge what she had been feeling for weeks, what she had perhaps felt since that first moment in Promise Creek, when he had stepped forward to defend her. She loved him, not with the fleeting infatuation of a girl, but with the deep, abiding love of a woman who had seen the true character of a man tested in the crucible of danger and found it unfailingly honorable. "You can't die," she whispered fiercely, bending close to his ear. "Not now, when I've only just found you." Whether he heard her or not, she couldn't tell. But as she settled into the chair beside him to begin her vigil, Elizabeth made a silent promise if Matthew recovered, she would find the courage to tell him how she felt, whatever the consequences might be. The night passed slowly. Elizabeth dozed intermittently, but woke at Matthew's slightest movement or change in breathing. Mr. Jenkins checked on them several times, showing her how to monitor the wound for signs of infection and how to help Matthew sip water when he briefly regained consciousness. By dawn, Matthew was running a slight fever not unusual with gunshot wounds, Mr. Jenkins assured her, but still concerning. Elizabeth bathed his forehead with cool cloths and spoke softly to him, uncertain if he could hear her, but drawing comfort from the simple act of caring for him. As morning brightened the parlor, Bobby arrived with coffee and biscuits for Elizabeth. "How is he?" the boy asked anxiously, peering at the still figure on the sofa. "He's strong," Elizabeth replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "He'll fight through this," Bobby nodded solemnly. "He's the bravest man I ever saw. Sam says he didn't even hesitate, just threw himself in front of that bullet to save Jimmy." The image brought fresh tears to Elizabeth's eyes, but she blinked them away. "That sounds like Matthew," she said softly, "always putting others first." Throughout the day, ranch hands came in small groups to check on their foreman, each with a story about how Matthew had earned their respect over the past months. Elizabeth remained at his side, leaving only briefly when Bobby insisted on taking her place while she went to freshen up. By evening, Matthew's fever had broken, and he was sleeping more naturally. The color had begun to return to his face, and Mr. Jenkins pronounced him out of immediate danger. "You should get some proper rest, Miss Palmer," the old rancher advised. "You've been at his side for nearly 24 hours. Bobby can watch him for a while." Elizabeth started to protest, but Mr. Jenkins held up a hand. "That's an order, young lady. You're no good to him if you collapse from exhaustion. Your cottage is just across the yard. You can be back here in minutes if needed." Reluctantly, Elizabeth agreed. She returned to her cottage, washed, changed into fresh clothes, and tried to rest on her bed. But sleep eluded her, her mind too full of worry for Matthew and the emotional revelations of the past day. After an hour of restless tossing, she gave up and returned to the main house. To her surprise, she found Matthew awake, propped up slightly on pillows, engaged in quiet conversation with Mr. Jenkins. He looked up when she entered, and the smile that spread across his pale face sent warmth flooding through her. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice weak but clear. "They told me you stayed with me all night." "Of course I did," she replied, moving to his side and resisting the urge to take his hand in full view of Mr. Jenkins. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been kicked by a particularly angry mule," Matthew admitted with a grimace. "But I'm told I'll live, thanks in no small part to your care." Mr. Jenkins rose from his chair with a knowing smile. "I believe I'll go check on the evening patrols. Miss Palmer can keep you company for a while." He winked at Elizabeth as he passed her, subtle as a charging bull. When they were alone, Matthew reached for her hand with his uninjured arm. "Sam told me what happened after I was shot. They drove off the rustlers without losing a single head of cattle." "That's because you trained them well," Elizabeth said, sitting in the chair Mr. Jenkins had vacated. "Everyone says your planning made all the difference." Matthew shook his head slightly. "I just did my job." His eyes, still bright with traces of fever, searched her face. "Sam also said you never left my side all night." Elizabeth felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "I was worried about you." "Just worried?" he asked softly, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of her hand in a gesture that was becoming familiar. The moment had come sooner than she expected, but Elizabeth found her earlier resolution still held firm. Taking a deep breath, she met his gaze directly. "No, not just worried," she admitted. "Terrified. When they brought you in, covered in blood, I thought I might lose you before I ever had the chance to tell you." She hesitated, then pressed on. "To tell you that I've fallen in love with you, Matthew Morgan." The words hung in the air between them, irrevocable. Matthew's expression softened into something so tender it made her heart ache. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I've been trying to find the courage to tell you the same thing for weeks now." His hand tightened on hers. "I love you. I think I started falling the moment I saw you in Promise Creek, standing up to your brother despite your fear." Joy bloomed in Elizabeth's chest, bright and overwhelming. "Really?" she asked, hardly daring to believe. "Really," he confirmed, a smile spreading across his face despite the pain he must still be feeling. "I was going to tell you that night on your porch before Bobby interrupted us with news of the rustlers." Elizabeth laughed softly, remembering. "I wondered what you were about to say." "I was going to ask if you might consider staying in Laramie permanently," Matthew continued, his eyes never leaving hers. "Not just as the cook at the Rocking J, but as—" he hesitated. "As my wife, if you'd have me." The words took her breath away. "Matthew, are you proposing to me while lying wounded on Mr. Jenkins's sofa?" His laugh turned into a wince of pain. "Not exactly how I planned it, I admit, but nearly dying has a way of clarifying what matters most." His expression grew serious again. "I love you, Elizabeth. I want to build a life with you if that's what you want too." Tears of happiness filled Elizabeth's eyes as she leaned forward to gently kiss him, mindful of his injury. "Yes," she whispered against his lips. "That's exactly what I want." When they finally broke apart, Matthew was smiling despite the lines of pain around his eyes. "Mr. Jenkins will be pleased. He's been dropping hints for weeks that I should stop mooning over you like a lovesick calf and do something about it." Elizabeth laughed. "He said something similar to me just yesterday. Apparently, we haven't been as subtle as we thought." "I don't want to be subtle anymore," Matthew said, reaching up to touch her cheek. "I want everyone to know how I feel about you." In that moment, with Matthew looking at her as if she were the most precious thing in the world, Elizabeth felt the last shadows of her painful past recede. The memory of Thomas, of what he had tried to do to her in Promise Creek, seemed to belong to another lifetime entirely. Here, in this room with this man, she had found not just safety but belonging. The home she had feared was lost forever after her father's death. And as Matthew pulled her down for another gentle kiss, Elizabeth knew with absolute certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, bound by a love that had begun in the most unlikely circumstances, but had grown into something unshakable and true. Matthew's recovery was slow but steady. The bullet had passed through his shoulder without hitting bone, and while the wound was painful and temporarily debilitating, it was not life-threatening. Within a week, he was able to move from the sofa in Mr. Jenkins's parlor to his own quarters in a small room attached to the bunkhouse. Elizabeth divided her time between her regular duties and caring for Matthew, bringing him special meals designed to help him regain his strength and changing his bandages with gentle hands. The ranch hands teased him good-naturedly about having such a pretty nurse, but there was genuine respect in their eyes for both Matthew's bravery during the rustler attack and Elizabeth's unwavering devotion to his recovery. News of their engagement spread quickly through the Rocking J, met with universal approval. Mr. Jenkins was particularly pleased, clapping Matthew on his good shoulder and declaring, "About time, son. I was beginning to think I'd have to lock you two in the root cellar together to make something happen." 3 weeks after the rustler attack, with Matthew up and about though still favoring his injured arm, they received unexpected visitors. Sheriff Donovan from Promise Creek, along with Marshal Hayes from Laramie, rode into the ranch yard one sunny morning. Elizabeth was in the main house, arranging fresh wildflowers in the crystal vase that had belonged to Mrs. Jenkins, when Bobby burst in to announce their arrival. "They're asking for you and Mr. Morgan, Miss Palmer," the boy reported excitedly. "Mr. Jenkins told me to fetch you both to the study." With a sense of foreboding, Elizabeth hurried to find Matthew, who was in the barn consulting with Sam about a mare about to foal. Together they walked to the main house, Matthew's hand supportively at the small of her back. "What do you think they want?" Elizabeth asked nervously as they approached. Matthew shook his head. "I'm not sure. Maybe news about Thomas, or perhaps they've captured the rustlers." In the study, Sheriff Donovan rose to greet them, his expression brightening at the sight of Elizabeth. "Miss Palmer, you're looking well. Life in Laramie seems to agree with you." "It does, Sheriff," Elizabeth confirmed, shaking his hand warmly. "It's good to see you again." Marshal Hayes, a tall, stern-looking man with a thick mustache, nodded to them both. "Mr. Morgan, Miss Palmer, thank you for meeting with us." Mr. Jenkins gestured for everyone to sit, and Bobby was dispatched to bring coffee. Once they were settled, Marshal Hayes got straight to the point. "We believe we've captured the gang of rustlers that's been terrorizing ranches in this area," he announced. 4 men were arrested in Cheyenne trying to sell stolen cattle. They match the descriptions provided by witnesses from the Peterson and Larson ranches, as well as your own men, Mr. Morgan. Matthew leaned forward, his expression intent. "That's good news, Marshal. Has there been a trial yet?" "Not yet. That's partly why we're here." Hayes exchanged a glance with Sheriff Donovan. "One of the men we arrested is claiming that the gang was hired by someone to specifically target the Rocking J. The other ranches were hit to make it look like a pattern, but their main objective was always Mr. Jenkins's cattle." A shocked silence fell over the room. Mr. Jenkins was the first to recover. "Hired? Who would do such a thing?" Sheriff Donovan cleared his throat. "That's where things get complicated. The man is claiming they were hired by Thomas Palmer." Elizabeth gasped. "But Thomas is dead." "You told me yourself, Sheriff." Donovan looked uncomfortable. "I'm afraid I was misinformed, Miss Palmer. Thomas was indeed shot during the confrontation at your ranch, but he survived. He disappeared before I could arrest him, properly fled Promise Creek while recovering from his wounds. The news that her brother was still alive sent a chill through Elizabeth. She had mourned Thomas, had come to terms with his death, and now to learn that he was not only alive but potentially behind the attack that had nearly killed Matthew. "Are you certain it was Thomas who hired them?" Matthew asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. "The description matches," Marshal Hayes confirmed. "And the timing aligns with when he disappeared from Promise Creek, but we need positive identification." Mr. Jenkins frowned. "You want Miss Palmer to identify her brother?" "If she's willing," the marshal confirmed. "The prisoners are being held in Laramie. We'd escort her there and back safely, of course." Elizabeth felt Matthew's hand close over hers, warm and reassuring. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. "Not if it's too difficult." She appreciated his concern, but her mind was already made up. If Thomas was truly behind the attack that had endangered everyone at the Rocking J, that had nearly cost Matthew his life, she needed to know for certain. "I'll go," she said firmly. "I want to see him for myself." The journey to Laramie was tense. Elizabeth rode beside Matthew, who had insisted on accompanying her despite the marshal's assurances of protection. Sheriff Donovan rode ahead with Marshal Hayes, occasionally looking back to check on them. "Are you sure about this?" Matthew asked as they neared the town. "Facing Thomas won't be easy." Elizabeth nodded, drawing strength from his presence beside her. "I need to do this not just for justice, but for myself. I need to close this chapter of my life once and for all." The Laramie jail was a solid stone building on the edge of town. Inside, Marshal Hayes led them to a small room with a barred window overlooking the cells. Through this window, Elizabeth would be able to see the prisoners without them seeing her. "The man who claims Thomas hired them is in the 3rd cell," Hayes explained. "He's agreed to cooperate in exchange for leniency." Elizabeth approached the window, Matthew at her side. Looking through the bars, she saw a row of cells, each containing 1 or 2 rough-looking men. In the 3rd cell, a wiry man with a scraggly beard sat on a narrow cot. "That's not Thomas," she said immediately. "No, madam," the marshal clarified. "That's Jed Wilkins, one of the rustlers. We want to confirm his story before we bring in the man he claims is Thomas Palmer." Sheriff Donovan stepped into the cell block, approaching Wilkins's cell. "Tell us again about the man who hired you," he instructed the prisoner. Wilkins stood, coming to the bars. "Medium height, dark hair, fancy dresser for these parts. Had a bandaged hand, said he'd been shot by a man named Morgan who'd run off with his sister. Paid us well to hit the Rocking J. Said we could take cattle from other ranches too as long as we made sure to hurt Morgan bad when we found him." Elizabeth's hand flew to her mouth. The description could certainly fit Thomas, and the mention of his wounded hand and his grudge against Matthew confirmed it. "Where is he now?" Sheriff Donovan pressed. Wilkins shrugged. "Don't rightly know. Said he'd meet us in Cheyenne after the job was done, pay us the rest of what he promised." "But we never made it that far, did we?" Hayes nodded to a deputy, who left briefly and returned leading another prisoner, a well-dressed man with dark hair and a face Elizabeth knew all too well. "Thomas," she whispered, involuntarily shrinking back from the window. Matthew's arm went around her shoulders, steadying her. "That's him." "You're sure?" She nodded, unable to take her eyes off her brother. Thomas looked different, thinner, harder, his face set in bitter lines, but it was unmistakably him. "We picked him up in a saloon in Laramie this morning," Marshal Hayes explained. "He was asking around about the Rocking J, trying to find out if the rustlers had succeeded." Elizabeth watched as Sheriff Donovan approached Thomas's cell. "Thomas Palmer, You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit cattle rustling, attempted murder, and fleeing justice in Promise Creek." Thomas's face contorted with rage. "You can't prove anything," he spat. "The word of a rustler against mine. Who do you think people will believe?" "They'll believe your sister," Donovan replied calmly. "And the evidence we found in your hotel room letters to Wilkins detailing the plan. A map of the Rocking J with the North Pasture marked, and a considerable sum of money that matches the amount Wilkins said you promised to pay after the job." Thomas's eyes darted around as if seeking escape, then settled on the observation window as if he could sense Elizabeth's presence behind it. "This is all her fault," he snarled. "Her and that interfering cowboy. The Palmer Ranch was mine. Everything was mine until they ruined it." Elizabeth turned away, unable to bear the hatred in her brother's voice. "I've seen enough," she said quietly. "That's Thomas." Outside the jail, in the clear Wyoming sunshine, Elizabeth took deep breaths to steady herself. Matthew stood beside her, a solid, reassuring presence. "Are you all right?" he asked gently when she had been quiet for several minutes. Elizabeth considered the question seriously. Seeing Thomas again had been painful, but not in the way she had expected. Instead of fear or grief, what she felt most strongly was pity for the man her brother had become, consumed by bitterness and hatred until nothing remained of the boy she had once loved. "Yes," she said finally, looking up at Matthew with clear eyes. "I think I am. Thomas made his choices. He'll face the consequences now. The marshal says he'll likely be sent to prison for many years," Matthew said, taking her hand in his. "He can't hurt you anymore, Elizabeth." She nodded, feeling a great weight lifting from her shoulders. "I know. And in a strange way, I'm grateful for what happened in Promise Creek that day." At Matthew's questioning look, she explained, "If Thomas hadn't tried to sell me to those men, you would never have intervened. We wouldn't have met. I wouldn't have found my way to the Rocking J to you." Matthew's expression softened. He lifted her hand to his lips, kissing it tenderly. "From something terrible came something beautiful," he agreed. "But I would give anything to spare you the pain you've endured." "The pain is part of what brought us here," Elizabeth said wisely. "And I wouldn't change where we are now for anything in the world." Sheriff Donovan and Marshal Hayes emerged from the jail, interrupting their moment. "Thomas and the rustlers will stand trial next week," Hayes informed them. "We'll need you both to testify." "We'll be there," Matthew assured him. As they prepared to return to the Rocking J, Sheriff Donovan pulled Elizabeth aside. "I almost forgot there's something for you at my office. It arrived in Promise Creek after you left, and I've been meaning to get it to you." Curious, Elizabeth followed him to the marshal's office. Inside, Donovan retrieved a small wooden box from a safe. "This came from your father's lawyer in Cheyenne. Apparently, he'd been trying to locate you." Elizabeth opened the box to find a sealed envelope and a smaller velvet pouch. The envelope contained a letter from the lawyer explaining that her father had left a separate bequest, specifically for her, a sum of money held in trust that Thomas could not access, along with her mother's jewelry. Inside the velvet pouch, she found her mother's wedding ring, a simple gold band with a small diamond, along with a pair of pearl earrings that had been a gift from her father to her mother on their 10th anniversary. "He made sure I would be provided for, even knowing how Thomas might react," Elizabeth said softly, deeply moved by this final act of paternal love. "Thank you for bringing these to me, Sheriff. They mean more than I can express." With her mother's ring and earrings safely tucked into her pocket, Elizabeth rejoined Matthew for the ride back to the Rocking J. As they traveled, she told him about her unexpected inheritance. "Your father was a wise man," Matthew observed. "He must have suspected Thomas might not honor his wishes." Elizabeth nodded, thinking of her father's foresight. The money isn't a fortune, but it's enough to give us a start. Perhaps we could buy a small piece of land someday, build something of our own." Matthew's eyes lit up at the suggestion. "I'd like that. Though for now, the Rocking J feels like home." "It does," Elizabeth agreed, looking ahead to where the ranch would soon come into view. "Mr. Jenkins says we can convert the old foreman's cabin into a proper house after we're married. It's twice the size of my cottage and has a nice view of the creek." "Speaking of marriage," Matthew said, suddenly looking nervous, "I've been meaning to ask when you might want to have the ceremony, now that you're brother." "Well, now that that situation is resolved, we could start making plans." Elizabeth smiled, touched by his consideration. "I don't want to wait too long. Life is too uncertain, as we've both learned." She thought for a moment. "Perhaps after the harvest, the weather will still be fair and the busy season will be over." "October, then," Matthew agreed, his face brightening. "That gives us 3 months to prepare." As the Rocking J came into view, Elizabeth felt a profound sense of rightness. This place, these people, Mr. Jenkins with his gruff kindness, Bobby with his youthful enthusiasm, the ranch hands with their rough loyalty, they had become her family. And Matthew, riding tall beside her despite his healing wound, had become the center of her world. The past 3 months had transformed her life in ways she could never have imagined. That desperate day in Promise Creek, when Thomas had tried to sell her to strangers. From the depths of fear and despair, she had found courage, purpose, and love, all because a brave cowboy had ridden up and said, "Not while I breathe." The trial of Thomas Palmer and the rustlers took place in Laramie in early August. Elizabeth and Matthew both testified, recounting the events in Promise Creek and the subsequent attack on the Rocking J. The evidence against Thomas and his hired men was overwhelming, and the jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning guilty verdicts. Thomas was sentenced to 15 years in the territorial prison, a harsh but just punishment for the lives he had endangered and the harm he had caused. When the sentence was announced, he stared at Elizabeth with cold hatred, but she met his gaze steadily, refusing to be intimidated any longer. Outside the courthouse, with the summer sun warm on her face, Elizabeth took Matthew's hand. "It's truly over now," she said, feeling a deep sense of closure. Matthew squeezed her hand. "A new chapter begins." The following weeks passed in a pleasant blur of preparation for their wedding. Mr. Jenkins insisted on hosting the celebration at the Rocking J, declaring that Elizabeth was as good as a daughter to him now. The ranch hands, led by Sam, began renovating the old foreman's cabin, repairing the roof, adding a new room, and building proper furniture to make it a comfortable home for the couple. Elizabeth threw herself into planning with enthusiasm, ordering fabric from Laramie for a wedding dress that Mrs. Fletcher helped her design and sew. The simple but elegant gown of ivory satin with lace trim was far more beautiful than anything Elizabeth had ever owned, and when she tried it on for the final fitting, Mrs. Fletcher declared her the loveliest bride Laramie has ever seen. On the first Saturday in October, with the aspen trees golden against the blue Wyoming sky, and a gentle breeze carrying the scent of sage and pine, Elizabeth Palmer became Elizabeth Morgan in a ceremony performed by the minister from Laramie on the front porch of the Rocking J main house. She wore her mother's pearl earrings and carried a bouquet of late-blooming wildflowers gathered by Bobby that morning. Matthew, handsome in a new suit, watched her approach with such love in his eyes that Elizabeth felt her heart might burst with happiness. Mr. Jenkins gave her away, his weathered face solemn with emotion as he placed her hand in Matthew's. "Take care of each other," he said gruffly. "That's all that really matters in this life." Their vows were simple but heartfelt, promises to love, honor, and cherish each other through whatever life might bring. When Matthew slipped her mother's gold ring onto her finger, resized by the jeweler in Laramie, to fit perfectly, Elizabeth felt the past and present merging into a future filled with promise. The celebration afterward was joyous tables set up in the ranch yard laden with food Elizabeth had prepared with help from neighboring women, music provided by one of the hands who played a fiddle, and dancing that continued well into the night. Even Sheriff Donovan had ridden from Promise Creek to attend, bringing news that the Palmer Ranch had been purchased by a decent family with young children who were bringing it back to life. As the evening stars appeared overhead, Matthew led his bride away from the festivities toward their new home, the renovated foreman's cabin that now boasted new curtains, a comfortable bed, a sturdy table and chairs, and even a small bookshelf filled with volumes that Mr. Jenkins had given them as a wedding gift. "Welcome home, Mrs. Morgan," Matthew said softly as he carried her over the threshold. Elizabeth wrapped her arms around his neck, overwhelmed with love for this man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved. "I love you, Matthew Morgan," she whispered against his lips. "More than I have words to express." His kiss was tender at first, then deepening with a passion that had been carefully restrained during their courtship. Here, finally alone as husband and wife, they could express the full measure of their love for each other, healing the last lingering wounds of their respective pasts with each tender touch and whispered endearment. Later, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their new home, Matthew traced gentle patterns on Elizabeth's bare shoulder. "Do you ever wonder," he asked softly, "what might have happened if I hadn't ridden into Promise Creek that day?" Elizabeth considered the question. "Sometimes. But then, I remember something my father used to say, that our lives are shaped not just by chance, but by the choices we make in response to what chance brings us." She propped herself up on one elbow to look at him in the moonlight streaming through the window. "You chose to intervene when you saw a woman in trouble. I chose to trust you when you offered help. Those choices led us here to this moment." Matthew smiled, pulling her close against his heart. "The best choice I ever made." As they drifted toward sleep in each other's arms, Elizabeth felt a profound sense of peace. The journey from Promise Creek to the Rocking J had been fraught with danger and uncertainty, but it had led to this, to home, to belonging, to a love that had been worth every step of the difficult path. Outside their window, the Wyoming night was alive with stars, each one a point of light in the vast darkness. And inside, in the warmth of their embrace, a new life was beginning, one built on courage, honor, and a love that had been forged in adversity but would endure for all the days to come. Epilogue. 5 years later, the spring sunrise painted the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold as Elizabeth Morgan stood on the porch of their home, cradling a cup of coffee in her hands. The Rocking J spread out before her, peaceful in the early morning light, cattle grazing on the lush spring grass, horses in the corral, smoke rising from the cookhouse chimney where she would soon be expected to prepare breakfast for the hands. So much had changed in 5 years, yet so much remained the same. The rhythms of ranch life continued, the seasonal round of calving, branding, driving cattle to summer pasture, and preparing for winter, but Elizabeth's place within those rhythms had evolved. She was no longer just the cook, though she still oversaw the preparation of meals with the help of a young woman from Laramie who had joined the ranch staff 2 years ago. Now Elizabeth was also a partner in running the Rocking J. Mr. Jenkins had made Matthew and her co-owners of the ranch when his health began to fail 3 years earlier. "The ranch needs young blood," he had declared, "and there's no one I trust more than you two to carry on what Martha and I built." though the old rancher still lived in the main house, now cared for by Bobby, no longer a boy but a capable young man of 21, and a nurse from town. The day-to-day management of the Rocking J had passed to Matthew and Elizabeth. They had expanded the operation, buying adjacent land when it became available, improving the quality of their breeding stock, and implementing new techniques that Matthew had learned from agricultural journals and visits to successful ranches in other territories. The Rocking J was now one of the most prosperous cattle operations in Wyoming Territory, known for its quality stock and fair treatment of its workers. The sound of childish laughter drew Elizabeth's attention to the side of the house, where a small figure came running around the corner, dark hair flying, pursued by Matthew, who was making exaggerated growling noises. "Mama, save me." 4-year-old Sarah squealed in delight as she dashed up the porch steps to hide behind Elizabeth's skirts. "Papa's being a bear again." Matthew lumbered up the steps, arms outstretched like a grizzly's paws. "Where's my breakfast?" he growled playfully. "I'm a hungry bear who eats little girls for breakfast." Sarah's giggles intensified as Matthew swept her up into his arms, tickling her until she gasped for mercy. Elizabeth watched them with a heart full of love. Sarah Margaret Morgan, named for both her grandmothers, was the light of their lives. A perfect blend of Matthew's dark hair and Elizabeth's hazel eyes, with a spirit as wild as the Wyoming wind and a heart as tender as spring flowers. "You two are going to wake James," Elizabeth admonished with mock sternness, unable to keep the smile from her face. As if on cue, a thin wail emerged from the open window of the nursery. Matthew set Sarah down with a kiss on her forehead. "Look what you did, little cub. You woke your brother." "I'll get him, Papa," Sarah declared importantly, rushing into the house with all the dignity a 4-year-old could muster in the face of such responsibility. Matthew joined Elizabeth at the porch railing, slipping an arm around her waist and pressing a kiss to her temple. "Good morning, Mrs. Morgan." "Good morning, Mr. Morgan," she replied, leaning into his embrace. "You're up early." "New calves in the north pasture," he explained. "Wanted to check on them before breakfast." His eyes, still as clear and honest as the day they'd met, studied her face with loving concern. "You look tired. James keeping you up again?" Elizabeth nodded, stifling a yawn. Their son, just 6 months old, was proving to be a more restless sleeper than his sister had been. "He was fussy most of the night. I think he's teething." "Why don't you go back to bed for a while?" "Sarah and I can manage breakfast, and Anna will be here soon to help with the cooking." Anna was their helper, a capable young woman from Laramie who had taken over many of Elizabeth's former duties. Elizabeth smiled gratefully. "That sounds wonderful, but Mr. Jenkins is expecting me to go over the accounts with him this morning. The cattle buyer from Cheyenne is coming next week." Matthew's expression grew more serious. "Jenkins wasn't looking well yesterday. Bobby says he barely touched his dinner." Elizabeth's heart tightened with concern for the old rancher who had become like a father to her. At 79, Harold Jenkins was frailer than he liked to admit, though his mind remained sharp as ever. "I'll look in on him first thing." They were interrupted by Sarah's return, proudly carrying her baby brother with Bobby's careful assistance. James Harold Morgan blinked sleepily in the morning light, his chubby face breaking into a toothless smile at the sight of his parents. "He's not crying anymore, Mama," Sarah announced, clearly pleased with her achievement. "I told him Papa wasn't really a bear, just pretending." "That was very kind of you, sweetheart," Elizabeth said, taking the baby from Bobby's supportive arms. "Thank you for helping, Bobby." The young man grinned. "No trouble, Mrs. Morgan. Little James here is a right gentleman compared to some of the colts I've had to handle." He tipped his hat to them. "Mr. Jenkins is awake and asking for his breakfast." Said to tell you he's feeling spry today and wants to ride out to see the new calves." Matthew and Elizabeth exchanged concerned glances. The old rancher hadn't been on a horse in months, despite his frequent declarations that he was just resting before getting back in the saddle. "I'll take his breakfast up and talk to him," Elizabeth decided. "Perhaps we can convince him to ride in the buckboard instead." As Bobby headed back to the main house, Matthew took James from Elizabeth's arms. "This young man needs changing before breakfast, I think," he said, making a face that set Sarah giggling again. "Come along, deputy," he said to his daughter. "I'll need your expert assistance." Elizabeth watched them go inside, her heart so full it almost hurt. In her wildest dreams back in Promise Creek, she could never have imagined this life: a loving husband, beautiful children, a prosperous ranch that was truly her home, and the respect of everyone in the community. The Morgans were now well established in Laramie society. Matthew served on the town council, and Elizabeth had helped establish a small school on the ranch for the children of the hands and neighboring homesteaders. They had built a good life together, one day at a time, through hard work, mutual respect, and unwavering love. Later that morning, after ensuring Mr. Jenkins was comfortably settled in the buckboard for his visit to the north pasture, with Bobby driving and strict instructions not to stay out too long, Elizabeth returned to their house to find Matthew at the table, papers spread before him. "Letter from Sheriff Donovan," he said, holding up an envelope. "Thomas is being released next month. Good behavior." Elizabeth sat down slowly, absorbing this unexpected news. She rarely thought of her brother any more. His hatred and betrayal had been eclipsed by the fullness of the life she had built without him. "Does he say what Thomas plans to do?" Matthew shook his head. "Only that he's required to report his whereabouts to the authorities for the next 5 years as a condition of his early release." He looked at her with concern. "Are you worried?" Elizabeth considered the question carefully. Once, the thought of Thomas free would have terrified her. Now, she found it produced only a distant sadness for what might have been between them as siblings if his nature had been different. "No," she said finally. "Thomas has no power over me anymore, hasn't for years, and I doubt he'd risk returning to prison by causing trouble." Matthew reached across the table to take her hand. "If he ever comes near you or the children—" "He won't," Elizabeth said with quiet certainty. "Whatever darkness drove him, it's his burden to carry, not mine." She squeezed Matthew's hand. "Our life is here with the people we love. Thomas belongs to the past." Matthew nodded, pride evident in his eyes. "You're the strongest woman I've ever known, Elizabeth Morgan." She smiled, thinking of how far she had come from that frightened young woman in Promise Creek. "I had a good teacher in courage," she said softly. "A certain cowboy who wasn't afraid to stand up for what was right." Matthew rose and came around the table, pulling her to her feet and into his embrace. "Best decision I ever made, riding into Promise Creek that day," he murmured against her hair. "Though I didn't know then I'd be getting a wife, 2 beautiful children, and a share in one of the finest ranches in Wyoming. And I didn't know I'd find my heart's true home," Elizabeth replied, lifting her face for his kiss. Outside, Sarah's voice called excitedly from the porch, "Mama, Papa. Mr. Jenkins is back, and he says he saw the prettiest new calf with a star on its forehead." Matthew chuckled against Elizabeth's lips. "Duty calls, Mrs. Morgan." "As always, Mr. Morgan," she replied with a smile. "Wouldn't have it any other way." Hand in hand, they stepped out into the Wyoming sunshine to meet their daughter, their future as bright and promising as the day stretching before them. From the moment, Matthew had ridden up and declared, "Not while I breathe." Their lives had been inextricably entwined, bound together by courage, strengthened by adversity. and sustained by a love that had only deepened with each passing year. And as they walked together across the ranch yard, with Sarah dancing ahead of them and James sleeping peacefully in his cradle inside, Elizabeth knew with absolute certainty that this was exactly where she was meant to be home at last, cherished and free under the vast Wyoming sky.